The house on Birchwood Lane had been quiet for hours. A still, moonless kind of quiet that settles over a neighbourhood when the world has gone to sleep and nothing is left awake but the crickets and the occasional passing of a car 2 streets over. Every light was off, every curtain drawn. Inside, the Callahan family slept the deep, trusting sleep of people who had no reason to believe the night held anything other than rest. Daniel Callahan, 34 years old, lay on his side of the bed with one arm draped across the edge of the mattress, his breathing slow and even. His wife, Mara, 31, slept curled beside him, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, her hand still loosely holding the baby monitor she had fallen asleep clutching, as she had every night for the past 7 months. Down the hall, in a room painted pale yellow with a small wooden mobile of birds hanging above the crib, their daughter Lily slept the soundless sleep of infancy. 7 months old, 8 pounds at birth. A child who had come into the world 2 weeks early but had never given her parents a single moment of medical concern since. She was healthy, round-cheeked, and utterly unaware of what was about to happen. At the foot of the hallway, on his worn rectangular bed beside the front door, lay Atlas, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a broad chest, dark amber eyes, and a coat the colour of autumn leaves and charcoal. His ears were the first thing most people noticed, large, alert, perpetually angled forward as though he was always listening for something just beyond what ordinary hearing could reach. Daniel had brought Atlas home as a puppy shortly after he and Mara moved into the house on Birchwood Lane, 2 years before Lily was born. He had never been trained as a service dog, never been certified for any specialized work. He was, by every official definition, simply a family pet. But there were things Atlas did that no one had ever taught him. He checked on Lily twice each night without being asked, rising from his bed, padding silently down the hall, and standing at the doorway of her room for long minutes before returning. Mara had noticed this in the first weeks after they brought Lily home from the hospital. She had watched it on the baby monitor camera. The dark shape of Atlas appearing in the doorway, utterly still, before disappearing again. It unnerved her at first. Then it became something she counted on. At 2:51 in the morning, Atlas lifted his head from his bed. His ears rotated forward with the precision of a satellite dish locking onto a signal. For 17 seconds, he remained motionless, processing something his human family could not perceive. Then he rose, not slowly, the way dogs rise when they are stiff or half asleep. He rose with purpose, his body fully engaged from the moment his paws hit the floor. He crossed the living room without a sound and went directly to the hallway. He did not stop at Lily's doorway the way he usually did. He went inside. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Let's continue with the story. Daniel and Mara Callahan had come to Clover Falls, Ohio 3 years ago from Pittsburgh, where Daniel had spent 6 years working as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm that specialized in bridge rehabilitation. At 34, he had the broad shoulders and careful hands of someone who spent his working life thinking about what held things together and what caused them to fail. His dark hair was beginning to show the first threads of grey at the temples, not from age so much as from the particular kind of worry that came with loving a young family and knowing, with an engineer's precision, exactly how many things could go wrong in any given system. He was not a fearful man. He was a prepared one. Mara had grown up in Clover Falls, the daughter of a high school biology teacher and a woman who ran the county's only independent bookstore. She had left for college in Columbus, stayed for graduate school, met Daniel at a mutual friend's dinner party during what she had always called the most accidental evening of her life, and eventually followed him back to the city where she grew up. which felt both like coming home and like seeing a familiar landscape through entirely new eyes. She was a pediatric occupational therapist who worked 3 days a week at a rehabilitation center 40 minutes north of Clover Falls. Her patience was professional grade, the kind built through years of working with children whose bodies or minds required extraordinary coaxing to do things other children did without thinking. She applied that same patience to everything: her work, her marriage, her daughter, her dog. Atlas had been her idea, technically. She had grown up with dogs and felt the absence of one in the house keenly in those first years of marriage when everything else was being built. Daniel had agreed with the particular ease of a man who had no strong opinion on the matter, but would later develop a very strong attachment to the animal in question. Atlas arrived at 8 weeks old, a squirming armful of black and tan fur with ears too large for his head and a habit of sitting on Daniel's feet while he drank his morning coffee. He grew into those ears. He grew into everything, including a disposition that the veterinarian, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patricia Hess, described at his first annual exam as unusually attentive. "That's a polite way of saying he watches everything," Mara had replied. Dr. Hess had smiled. "Some dogs just pay more attention to the world than others. These ones tend to surprise you." Lily arrived 7 months before the night in question, born on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, but without complication. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn lower lip, and she slept from the very beginning, with the total commitment of someone who had decided that rest was the most important activity available to her. Atlas had met her the afternoon they brought her home from the hospital. He had approached the car seat with slow, deliberate steps, his nose working carefully, his body low and unthreatening. He had sniffed the air around her for nearly a full minute. Then he had backed away and sat down and looked at Daniel with an expression that Daniel would later describe, with some embarrassment, as one of the most serious looks he had ever received from any living creature. From that evening forward, Atlas treated Lily with a gravity that had no precedent in his otherwise cheerful and moderately mischievous personality. The dog who stole socks and harassed the neighbor's cat and once ate an entire stick of butter off the kitchen counter became, in Lily's presence, something else entirely. Watchful, deliberate, unhurried. Mara had read about it, the way certain dogs seemed to instinctively adjust their behavior around infants. She had read about it the way she read about most things, thoroughly and with appropriate skepticism. Watching Atlas circle Lily's bouncer with that particular expression, she decided the research was insufficient. At 2:51 in the morning on a Thursday in March, Atlas stood inside Lily's room beside the crib. The night light cast a pale blue glow across the walls, illuminating the mobile of birds, the neatly folded blankets on the small chair in the corner, the shelf of stuffed animals that Lily could not yet reach. Atlas stood with his nose directed toward the crib, perfectly still for 11 seconds. Then he rose onto his hind legs and placed his front paws on the top rail of the crib, something he had never done before in his life. He looked down at Lily. He looked for a long time. Then he dropped back to the floor, turned to the doorway, and began to bark. Not the casual, loose bark of a dog reacting to a sound outside. This was different, tight and insistent, each sound clipped short, the bark of an animal communicating something it believes cannot wait. Down the hall, Mara startled awake with the disoriented urgency that all parents of young children develop, the ability to go from deep sleep to full alertness in under 2 seconds when something sounds wrong. She sat up. The baby monitor in her hand showed the blue glow of Lily's room. She could not see Atlas. She could hear him. Daniel was already sitting up beside her. "What is he?" he started. "Lily," Mara said. She was already moving. Atlas was still barking when they reached the hallway. They could see him in the pale light, standing in Lily's doorway, his whole body angled toward them with a kind of frantic intention they had never seen before. He barked twice more, then turned and went back into the room. When Mara reached the crib, Lily appeared to be sleeping normally. She was on her back, her small arms raised above her head in the position she always slept in, her chest rising and falling. Mara's first instinct was relief. Her second instinct, the one trained by years of working with children whose conditions defied casual observation, made her lean closer. Lily's lips had a faint bluish cast that had not been there at her last feeding. Her breathing, which should have been audible in the quiet room, was barely perceptible. Mara picked her up. The baby's body had the particular heaviness of deep, involuntary sleep. Not the soft, yielding weight of a child who would stir when held, but something heavier, something wrong. "She's not right," Mara said. Her voice was entirely calm in the way that voices go calm when the brain has shifted into a mode that has no room for anything except the next necessary action. "Daniel, call 911. Atlas had stopped barking. He stood at the edge of the room watching them, his chest still heaving, his amber eyes moving between Mara and the baby with an expression that, in any other moment, would have been impossible to interpret. In this moment, it required no interpretation at all. The 911 dispatcher who answered Daniel Callahan's call at 2:53 in the morning was a 12-year veteran named Carol Simmons, who had handled more emergency calls than she could count. She would later tell her supervisor that something in the caller's voice, not panic, but a particular quality of controlled urgency, made her dispatch the ambulance before she had finished the intake protocol. "Sir, I need you to stay on the line with me," she said. "Is the baby breathing?" "She's breathing," Daniel said, "but something is wrong. My wife is a pediatric therapist. She says something is wrong." In the background, Carol could hear a dog, not barking anymore, but making a low, continuous sound that she would describe afterward as almost like a conversation. The Clover Falls fire station on Meridian Avenue was 4 minutes and 20 seconds from the house on Birchwood Lane under normal conditions. At 2:54 in the morning, with no traffic, Paramedic Unit 7 made it in 3 minutes and 8 seconds. The two paramedics who came through the Callahans' front door were Ryan Kowalski, 29 years old and in his 5th year with Clover Falls Emergency Services, and his partner, Denise Ibarra, 37, who had spent 6 years working pediatric transport before moving to general emergency response. Denise Ibarra was the one who assessed Lily in those first critical seconds, her hands moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to read what infants could not say out loud. She noted the color. She noted the breathing pattern. She noted the oxygen saturation reading on the portable monitor Kowalski had applied within seconds of their arrival. 71%, Kowalski said. Denise did not respond verbally. She was already working. Atlas had retreated to the corner of the living room when the paramedics came in, which Daniel registered with some distant part of his mind. As unusual. The dog, who typically investigated every visitor with the enthusiasm of an elected official greeting constituents, had pressed himself against the far wall and was watching the hallway with an intensity that made him look less like a family pet and more like something that had been stationed there. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He watched. In the pediatric ward of Clover Falls General Hospital, there was a doctor named James Whitfield, who had been a neonatologist and pediatric pulmonologist for 22 years. He was 56, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up to his forehead and the particular unhurried manner of someone who had learned, over 2 decades, that calm was not the absence of urgency, but its most productive form. He had been called in at 3:17 in the morning, 40 minutes before Lily Callahan arrived, on a separate case. He was still in the building when the ambulance pulled in. He was the one who met Mara Callahan's eyes in the fluorescent corridor outside the trauma bay, and understood without being told that this was a mother who knew enough about medicine to be more frightened than a parent, without that knowledge, would have been. "Tell me what you observed at home," he said, "not what the paramedics told you." "What you saw," Mara told him. She was precise and sequential, and did not waste words. When she finished, Dr. Whitfield looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something internal. "You said the dog woke you?" "Yes." "Has he ever done that before?" "Never. Not once in 7 months." Whitfield nodded once and went through the doors. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our videos. We upload new content every single day, and we'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Daniel and Mara sat in the waiting area outside the pediatric intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. The chairs were upholstered in a muted blue that someone had clearly selected to be calming, and that achieved the opposite effect in the particular context of sitting in them at 3 in the morning waiting for news about your child. Daniel had his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in front of him in the posture of a man who was holding himself together through the application of deliberate physical stillness. Mara sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, which was how she sat when she was most afraid. Not collapsed inward, but pulled taut, as though relaxing any part of herself would cause something to give way. They had called Mara's parents from the ambulance. They had not called anyone else. There was nothing to say yet that could be shaped into words anyone would know how to receive. The house on Birchwood Lane was empty. Atlas was alone there, which neither of them had thought about until Daniel mentioned it quietly, and then they both sat with that fact for a moment. The dog alone in the house, where he had raised an alarm that may have saved their daughter's life, with no one to tell him whether it had worked. At 4:40 in the morning, Dr. Whitfield came through the doors and walked toward them with the measured pace of a man who had delivered enough news in his career to know that the walk itself communicated something before the words began. His expression was serious, but not devastated. Daniel stood up. Mara did not, because her legs had made the decision for her. Dr. Whitfield sat down across from them, which was a thing doctors did when they intended to stay long enough for the information to be absorbed. "Your daughter," he said, "experienced an acute respiratory event consistent with a condition called sudden unexplained infant respiratory arrest." He paused to allow that to land. "It is distinct from SIDS in that the child survives, but only if intervention occurs within a very narrow window of time." The oxygen saturation reading when the paramedics arrived was 71%. In most cases of this kind, by the time a parent is alerted by conventional means, a monitor alarm, a child's cry, that number has already dropped to a level incompatible with full neurological recovery. Daniel heard the sentence. He processed each word individually, and then he processed them as a group, and then he sat back down because his body had decided that standing was no longer an appropriate activity. Mara's hand found his. "You're saying," she said quietly, "that if we had waited any longer." Dr. Whitfield looked at her directly. "I am saying that the margin was minutes, not many of them." Mara closed her eyes. She kept them closed for several seconds. When she opened them, something had shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, because Lily was still in the unit behind the closed doors and the night was not over. But something. She asked the questions that came next in the methodical sequence of a professional mind gathering information it needed, and Dr. Whitfield answered them with the same methodical precision, and Daniel sat beside her, holding her hand, and listening and thinking about a dog asleep on his bed by the front door, who had stood up in the dark and gone to check on their daughter, and found something that every piece of technology in the house had missed. The baby monitor on the nightstand had not alarmed. The movement sensor clipped to Lily's sleep sack had not triggered. The room temperature monitor, the audio receiver, the video feed on the app that Mara checked before bed every night, none of them had indicated anything out of the ordinary. The breathing rate displayed on the monitor app had shown a number that fell within the normal range for an infant in deep sleep. Whatever Atlas had detected, it had not been detectable by instruments. Mara's mother, Carolyn, arrived at the hospital at 4:55 in the morning, still wearing her coat over her pajamas, her silver hair not yet brushed, her face carrying the particular expression of a grandmother who had received a phone call she would spend the rest of her life being grateful did not end differently. She embraced her daughter in the corridor without a word. She held her for a long time. Then she pulled back and looked at her and said simply, "How is she?" "She's going to be okay," Mara said. Those 4 words were the first time she had said them aloud, and saying them made them real in a way that thinking them had not. She's going to be okay. Dr. Patricia Hess, Atlas's veterinarian, would not learn what had happened until 2 days later when Mara called her from the hospital. Dr. Hess sat at her desk with the phone in her hand and listened to the account in full before she said anything. She asked 2 questions. The first was whether Lily was recovering well, and the answer was yes. She was expected to be discharged within 72 hours with a monitoring protocol and a follow-up plan. The second question was whether Atlas had shown any sign of distress that night before he began barking. Mara thought about it. She thought about the footage she had reviewed on the baby monitor app, watching Atlas appear in the doorway of Lily's room in the blue, half-dark, standing there with his nose directed at the crib. He was still, she said, very still for a while. Then he barked. Dr. Hess was quiet for a moment. "There is research," she said eventually, "into canine detection of physiological changes that precede medical events. Changes in breath chemistry, in skin chemistry, in the subtle biological signals that the human body produces before an overt crisis becomes visible. The research is ongoing. There is no consensus on the mechanism. But the documented cases are numerous enough that dismissing them as coincidence requires a particular kind of selective attention." She paused. "What I can tell you is that Atlas is not a trained medical alert dog. Whatever he detected that night, he detected because he was paying attention, because he had always been paying attention." In the years after that night, Mara would return to that sentence more times than she could count, because he had always been paying attention. It was, she would eventually conclude, the most important thing anyone said to her in the entire experience, not the diagnosis, not the statistics about the survival window, not the careful, generous words of Dr. Whitfield in the waiting room chairs. The most important thing was the simplest thing, and it was about a dog. It was about what happened when something, decided that paying attention was the most important work available to them, and did it without being asked, and without recognition, and without any understanding of what the recognition would eventually look like when it came. Atlas was at the door when they came home from the hospital. He pressed his nose against the car seat carrier the moment Daniel set it on the floor, his whole body trembling with the particular intensity of an animal reunited with something it had been guarding from a distance. Lily, awake for once and regarding the world from the carrier with her characteristic expression of serious-minded inquiry, looked at Atlas. Atlas looked at Lily. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Lily made a sound, a small, formless sound of recognition, and Atlas lay down on the floor beside her and put his head on his paws and exhaled. Daniel looked at Mara. Mara looked at Daniel. There were no words adequate to the moment. There rarely are. The story of what Atlas did on that Thursday morning in March might have remained a private thing, known only to the Callahan family and the small circle of medical professionals who had been present for the hours that followed. It might have become one of those family stories told quietly at dinner tables and passed along in hushed, grateful tones to close friends. The kind of story that accumulates meaning over years precisely because it is held close rather than broadcast. That is what Daniel and Mara intended in those first weeks after Lily came home from the hospital. They were private people by nature, both of them, and the experience had left them with the particular tenderness of those who have stood very close to an unbearable loss and walked away from it intact. They wanted to hold that tenderness carefully. They did not want it handled by strangers. It was Carolyn, Mara's mother, who changed the trajectory of things, though she did so without calculation or strategy. She mentioned what had happened to her friend Barbara at their weekly Tuesday morning walk. Barbara mentioned it to her daughter. Her daughter mentioned it to a colleague who worked at the regional newspaper. And 3 weeks after Lily came home from the hospital, a reporter named Tom Elgin called Daniel's cell phone and asked if the family would be willing to speak with him about their German shepherd. Daniel's first instinct was to decline. He discussed it with Mara that evening, after Lily was asleep. Atlas stretched across the foot of the couch between them in his characteristic posture of a dog who believed furniture was a shared resource. Mara was quiet for a long time before she said what she was thinking. There might be another family, she said, another baby, another dog that nobody's paying attention to. Daniel looked at her. She looked at Atlas. That was the end of the conversation about whether to speak with Tom Elgin. The article ran on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the night in question. It was 4 columns, with a photograph of Atlas sitting beside Lily's stroller in the Callahans' front yard, his ears forward, his expression one of absolute attentiveness. The headline was simple. The story was not. Within 48 hours, the article had been shared across the country. By the end of the week, Daniel's email inbox contained messages from 43 states and 11 countries. Most of them followed the same pattern, a variation on the phrase, "We thought we were the only ones." A family in Minnesota wrote about their Labrador, who had woken them 3 months earlier by pawing at their bedroom door with an urgency that turned out to correspond with their infant son's first febrile seizure. A couple in rural Georgia described their mixed-breed dog who had refused to leave their daughter's room one afternoon and had barked at the closed door until they opened it and found the child in respiratory distress. A grandmother in coastal Portugal wrote, in careful English, about her son's family dog who had alerted them to her granddaughter's hypoglycemic episode at 2 in the morning, before any monitor had registered anything irregular. The messages were not anecdotal in the way that word is sometimes used dismissively. They were specific. They were detailed. They came from people who had no particular investment in claiming that their dogs were extraordinary, who were, in many cases, writing because they had spent months feeling vaguely embarrassed about attributing medical significance to an animal's behavior, and who were relieved, with a relief that was almost physical, to discover they were not alone in that experience. Dr. Whitfield read the article on his lunch break and then read it again, more slowly. He had spent 22 years in pediatric medicine, and he held a particular combination of views on the subject of canine medical detection that was neither dismissive nor credulous, but genuinely, methodically curious. He had encountered 2 cases in his career that he could not explain through conventional means, in which a family dog's behavior had been the first indicator of a developing medical event in a child. He had noted them. He had not known what to do with them. He called the hospital's research liaison that afternoon and asked about the literature on canine olfactory detection of physiological change. "There is," she told him, "considerably more of it than most clinical practitioners realize." He asked her to compile it. Then he called a colleague at the Children's Hospital in Columbus who had been running a small underfunded study on trained medical alert dogs for children with epilepsy. "I may have something relevant for you," Whitfield said. "I need to talk to a family first." He called Daniel Callahan the following morning. Daniel listened to what the doctor proposed: a structured interview, a review of Atlas's behavioral history, potential participation in a research inquiry, and was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking carefully rather than reacting. Then he said, "Let me ask my wife." The research inquiry that eventually emerged from those conversations was modest in its initial scope and significant in its eventual reach. It was led by Dr. Whitfield in collaboration with the Columbus Children's Hospital team and a veterinary behaviorist from Ohio State University named Dr. Sandra Okafor, whose work on canine sensory cognition had been published in 3 peer-reviewed journals but had never crossed into the mainstream awareness of pediatric medicine. The Callahan case, Dr. Okafor would later write in the paper that brought her work its widest audience, represents a category of spontaneous, untrained, canine medical alerting behavior that has been systematically underreported in clinical literature, not because it is rare, but because the medical community has lacked an adequate framework for receiving and documenting anecdotal reports from families. Atlas himself was evaluated by Dr. Okafor in a series of sessions at the Callahan's home over a period of 8 weeks. He submitted to these evaluations with the cooperative gravity of an animal who had decided that whatever was being asked of him was probably reasonable. He was not, Dr. Okafor confirmed, trained in any formal sense to detect medical distress. His olfactory capability was, as measured by standardized assessments, within the upper range of normal for a German Shepherd of his age. Nothing about him was exceptional by the measures the tests were designed to capture. "What is exceptional, Doctor?" Okafor told Mara during their last session, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and Atlas occupying the floor between them with his customary air of dignified presence. "Is his attention." She turned her pen between her fingers thoughtfully. "Most dogs have the physical capability to detect what Atlas detects. The question is always whether they are oriented toward it, whether they are, in some fundamental sense, paying attention to the right things. Some dogs are. It may be partly temperament. It may be partly the bond, the degree to which a dog has made a particular human being the organizing principle of its attention." She glanced at Atlas. He looked back at her with his amber eyes, steady and without apology. "Whatever the mechanism," she said, "he was paying attention. And he acted on what he found. That is not a small thing. Lily Callahan was 8 months old when she was discharged from Clover Falls General with a clean bill of health and a monitoring protocol, that doctor. Whitfield had designed specifically for her case. She was 9 months old when she pulled herself to standing for the first time by gripping the lowest rail of Atlas's back while he stood patiently beside her, a living piece of furniture she had apparently decided was ideally suited to the purpose. She was 10 months old the first time she said a sound that her parents interpreted as the dog's name. Not quite the word, but aimed at him unmistakably, with the pointing certainty of an infant who has identified something important in her world. Atlas received this with the equanimity of an animal who had been expecting it. Daniel captured the moment on his phone without thinking, the way parents capture the moments that arrive before they have time to prepare for them. The photograph showed Lily in her onesie with her arm extended toward Atlas, her face scrunched with the effort of communication, and Atlas sitting at her level with his ears forward and his expression conveying with remarkable clarity that he understood perfectly. Daniel sent it to Mara, who was at the rehabilitation center that day, with no caption. Mara looked at it, for a long time. Then she sent back 2 words. That's everything. There was a ceremony, eventually. There always is in stories like this one, as though the human need to formalize gratitude requires a room and an audience, and someone standing at a microphone. In this case, it was a modest affair organized by the Clover Falls Community Foundation in the town hall meeting room on a Saturday afternoon in October. The room was fuller than anyone had expected. The local fire chief was there. Dr. Whitfield came, along with 2 members of his research team. Dr. Okafor drove up from Columbus. Mara's parents sat in the second row. Tom Elgin, the reporter who had written the original article, stood near the back with his notebook closed, there as a witness rather than a journalist. Daniel stood at the front of the room with Lily on his hip and Atlas sitting beside him on a short lead, wearing a new collar that Mara had bought for the occasion and looking with measured interest at the assembled crowd. The chief of the Community Foundation, a compact and energetic woman named Grace Hollis, who had run the organization for 11 years, spoke briefly about what the Callahan family's story had meant to the community and the conversations it had sparked about the role of animals in family safety. She spoke about the messages that had come in from across the country, the research inquiry that was now formally underway, and the small fund the foundation had established to support a pilot program that would train and place medical alert dogs with families of children with neurological conditions throughout the region. Then she turned to Atlas and said, with the slightly self-conscious sincerity of someone who is aware of how a thing sounds and has decided it needs to be said anyway, that there were kinds of attention the world did not have adequate words for, that there were kinds of loyalty that operated beyond the reach of training and instruction and formal recognition, that sometimes the most important act of protection in any given moment was simply the act of not looking away. Atlas accepted the small engraved medallion that was clipped to his collar with the dignified composure of an animal who had no particular feelings about ceremony but was willing to cooperate with it. He sat still while the photographs were taken. He permitted Lily, now riding steadily on Daniel's hip and regarding the proceedings with the imperious calm of a child who has absorbed the fact that she is the reason for the gathering, to grip his ear with the proprietary confidence she brought to all interactions with him. He turned his head once to check on her, the way he always did, the way he had always done. Then he looked back at the room with his amber eyes steady and present, the same eyes that had looked down into a crib at 2:51 in the morning and found something that could not wait, and had made the only decision available to an animal that had long ago made a particular family the entire purpose of its attention. That evening, after the ceremony, after the guests had gone and Lily was asleep in her room with the mobile of birds turning slowly above her crib, Daniel and Mara sat on the back porch of the house on Birchwood Lane in the October, cool with mugs of tea and Atlas between them on the wooden boards. The neighborhood was quiet. The sky above the tree line held the last pale residue of daylight along the western edge, the stars beginning to show above it in the east. Daniel looked at Atlas for a long time. The dog was watching the yard with the thoughtful, unhurried attention he brought to all things at the end of a day. Methodical, peaceful, oriented outward. "You know," Daniel said, "I used to think the monitor was enough. The app, the sensors, all of it. I thought we had it covered." Mara wrapped both hands around her mug. "And now?" "Now I think," he said slowly, "that there is no substitute for something that actually cares." He looked at Atlas. The dog did not look back. He was still watching the yard, still attending to the darkness at the edge of the tree line with the patient thoroughness of a guardian who understood that the work was ongoing and that the night was long and that nothing of value was protected by looking away. Mara put her head on Daniel's shoulder. The October air moved through the yard, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the street. Lily slept in her yellow room. The mobile turned above her crib, and Atlas kept watch the way he had always kept watch, the way he would keep watch for as long as he was able, asking nothing in return for the most complete devotion one creature can offer another. Simply the chance to remain close, and to be given the chance to be useful, and to know that the things it loves are safe. There are bonds in this world that do not require a common language. There are forms of love that do not announce themselves or seek acknowledgement or wait to be asked. Sometimes the most faithful thing in a house is the one that cannot tell you what it knows, that can only rise from its bed in the dark and go toward the thing that is wrong, and make enough noise until someone with hands and a phone and the ability to open a front door finally understands what it has been trying to say. We often speak about protection as though it were a system, as though safety were something we could design and install and verify on a screen before we go to sleep. And perhaps it is, partly. Perhaps the monitors and the sensors and the apps have their place in the architecture of care. But there is something they cannot replicate. There is something that only lives in attention freely given, in devotion that has no off switch, in the particular quality of love that does not calculate the cost of waking up at 3 in the morning and going down a dark hallway to check on something it has decided matters more than its own comfort or rest. Atlas was not trained for what he did. He was not asked. He was not rewarded in any currency he understood. He did what he did because he had spent 4 years making a family the center of his world, and because on one March night that world needed him, and he did not look away. That is the whole of it. That is enough. If you've made it to the end of this story, take a moment to share it with someone who loves a dog, or a family with young children, or anyone who has ever been protected by something that had no way of explaining why it stayed close. Leave a like below and subscribe to the channel. We upload a new story every single day, and there is always another one worth hearing. We will see you tomorrow.